Well, I think it's time for us to get started today. Thank y'all for coming, and thank Kappa for providing the lunch. We appreciate your generosity in this, and it's wonderful. I want to make a couple of announcements. A week from today, there'll be a meet and greet here for worship leader, composer, and pianist Zeke Listenby. He's a person that grew up here and has done real well in his musical endeavors, and is coming back to have a fundraiser concert for the Alicia Robinson Scholarship Program, and we'll have him here just at noon, from noon till 1:30 a week from today on the 28th. And the concert is that night on the 28th at the school. And I'll go ahead and tell you our March Museum Moments will be Joed Morris with his latest novel, Prisoners. I don't know how many books Joed has written, but it's several, and he'll kick it off here next month. Today's program is like a breath of spring, unlike our weather out there. You know, there's always hope when you start looking at flowers and seed catalogs, and I know we're all ready for it. And our speaker today is on a mission. His mission is to educate, to motivate us all to and appreciate the native plants, and he has some very good reasons that he'll relate to you. Robert Ballard is a horticulturist and landscape designer. He graduated from Mississippi State University, and he's the person I go to when I come up with a plant I don't know how to identify, and I'm always grateful that he identifies it for me. He grew up in Louisiana near a 300,000 acre wilderness and swamp. Imagine that. Honey Island Swamp and the Pearl River National Scenic Waterway. He came to this area and finished high school at New Albany and attended Mississippi State University, met Nanette, his beautiful wife, and they have 3 sons, Andrew, Marshall, and Jackson, and 2 granddaughters. And I believe Andrew is working with Robert now on this new adventure they've got, Camp Creek Natives, here in New Albany, which I'm very excited about. They already have thousands of native plants growing in a greenhouse, and a source that'll be much more accessible than us trying to find them somewhere else. So please join me in welcoming Robert Ballard.
I wanted to try to, and if you don't mind, just for a minute, I'm going to ask for a show of hands, if you don't mind. How many of you here consider yourself gardeners, whether it's, well, really I'm talking about flower gardeners. How many of you consider yourself a flower gardener? Do or did, that's all right. We're mainly talking about do now, but okay, that's pretty good percentage of it. How many of you are familiar with this trend, and trend's the wrong word, but for a better word, lack of a better word, are familiar with native plants and the reason that I'm here today to talk to you about native plants? How many of you? Well, quite a few of you again. So there's plenty of you here. I'm looking for, you know, people who know nothing about it, but there's a few, there's a few here. Those who raised their hands there, let me ask you this. How many of you, and it's time to start planting, and maybe if you are a gardener, you're already planting and thinking about what you're going to plant this spring. How many of you have thought about this spring including native plants in what you do in your yard? Let's see it. Okay. All right. Now that's where I have to get on to you a little bit, and that's why I'm here today, is to talk to you about native plants and why you want to have them in your garden, why you want to have them around the house. We're blessed to have from creation there was perfection, and we're blessed to have that. And what I try to teach people, as far as educate people, is for them to understand that, you know, we can drive around in North Mississippi, and particular times of year, especially in the fall, we're blessed with so many flowers, and it's not hard for us to drive around and admire a beautiful flower. But what I have done in recent years is, you know, I admire them just like anyone else, but what I have done is taken the time to stop and take a closer look at them and find out why they're here, what they're doing for us. You know, there are specific reasons for everything that we have in our ecology. Again, creation was perfect. And once you begin to look at it closer and see those relationships that are developed between native plant, and it ultimately ends up to a relationship with you and I, how we live our lives, how we put food on our table. These things are all completely dependent upon the plants that we were blessed with at creation for North Mississippi. And I struggle with glasses, by the way. They'll come on and off. But now that I know who I'm dealing with, y'all have raised your hands. I know who you are, and there's some native plant enthusiasts and some people who are just here to hear me speak and try to follow along, and that's okay. But, you know, I studied horticulture at Mississippi State, and that's been a long time ago now. I finished in 1980, so that's closing in on 40 years. There was really no emphasis at all at that time on native plants, and that's not surprising because these things have really come about here of late. What I studied was called ornamental horticulture, and these are the plants that most of us have around our yards and in landscapes. Now, you probably also have some native plants, but because you're not real familiar with just what that is, and we'll get to that, you probably also have some native plants in there. But we studied what was called ornamental horticulture. And therein, and this is a rabbit hole I'm going to go ahead and jump into, ornamentals that we studied, and the ornamentals that you have around your house, studies show that 80% of what we plant around our house are not American native plants. They're plants that come from China, India, Japan, Europe, just across the world, really. And, you know, as man, we've always kind of wanted what we don't have anyway. So we see these beautiful things. Let's take camellias, for instance. They're from China. And we've got to have them in our landscapes. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. And there's nothing wrong. I'm not here to tell you that you need to remove everything that you have in your yard and replace it with native plants. I am here to tell you that I do feel not just my own personal responsibility to inform you about it, but I do feel like you need, as gardeners, you need to understand those plants that we term as, this will help my nerves, I guess. Those plants that we term invasive. And maybe you're familiar with invasives and maybe you're not. But the ornamentals that we've been planting for years and years in our landscapes, again, come from other parts of the world. And this goes back to creation and the relationships that are involved in our ecology. Those plants that we bring from the other parts of the world, we don't bring along with them the insects, the butterflies, the control measures. In nature, there's a system, just like your government, there's a system of checks and balances. If something grows and proliferates, then here comes the herbaceous insects to feed on it and get it back into control. And then comes the carnivorous insects to get those herbaceous insects back in control. It's perfect. It was a perfect situation, but we messed it up. That's okay. It's to be expected, really. But what you need to understand is that what we have been planting around our houses for years, and I'm as guilty as anyone until 4 years ago, what we've been planting for years around our houses and in our common areas, industrial landscapes, wherever, are exotic plants that do nothing for the ecology here in North Mississippi or here anywhere in North America. One example I like to use that everyone is familiar with kudzu. Kudzu comes from Southeast Asia, where it's just another vine. And when we bring it out of that country and bring it to North America where there is no checks and balance system in place, look what it does. That's just the poster child for invasive plants. There's many of them. And some of them you're not going to want to hear about because we've adored them for a number of years. But I beg you to understand what these invasive plants are doing and to refuse to plant these plants any longer in your landscape. Of course, no one is planting kudzu. We plant a lot of Elaeagnus. We plant a lot of Elaeagnus. Disastrous plant. We need to cut that one out. Get rid of it if you have it. I've been in beautiful river bottoms that are nothing but Elaeagnus. It has taken total control of the river bottom. It is such an aggressive plant that it roots out everything that our father placed there, and it takes over in complete control, just like kudzu does on the forest edge. Those are invasive plants, and that's what invasive plants do. They are so aggressive, again, because they have no checks and balance system in place in this country that they had where they came from. Elaeagnus comes from Russia. That they're allowed to proliferate with no control. Another one, this one that's going to upset you, is Nandina. Nandina domestica. You know, it's everywhere. Any older home has Nandina. I have Nandina in our house. My backyard, a portion of my backyard, is like the poster child for invasive species. And I live there, I haven't cleaned it up yet. But in an area smaller than this room, I have Elaeagnus, I have Nandina, I have Chinese privet, I have Kellery pear, I have red mulberry, and I have nothing that's Native American. Nothing. It's all invasive, and that's how quick it goes. And here's another part of the hard sell. Soon to be blooming all over the place are the Kellery pear trees. You know, they're starting to bloom right now. That's the white flower that you're going to see on the wood's edge here or there. Listen to me. That one is about to become worse than Chinese privet. Kellery pear is a disaster happening right now. It is so aggressive and so uncontrollable. That's another plant that I'm getting to ask you, don't plant them. If you got them, get rid of them. And these are harsh statements, but this is where I am with it. You know, this is where I am with it. Do what we can to stop it because it is pushing aside the plants that our native insects and our native birds have to have. We used to could ride to Oxford, and here I'm still in the rabbit hole, aren't I? Yeah. Used to could drive to Oxford, particularly when we were teenagers, 20 years ago, and all along the fence row was a plant called Possum Hall holly. In the wintertime, they'd be full of berries. They're so beautiful. But what's there now? Chinese privet. The Possum Hall holly is gone. You can still find them, but not near like it was, I said, 20, 30, 40 years ago. Slowly being pushed away. Now, what's the importance there? Possum Hall holly fruits during the wintertime. American native birds are dependent upon winter fruit for survival. So we lose that tree, we lose birds along with it. We lose birds, then certain insects are going to explode in populations, and then you know, it's a system of keeping things in check. And they're out of control right now. We're losing species, and this is a whole different rabbit hole. I'll only stay in it for a minute. But we're losing species right now off the planet at a greater rate than science says, at a greater rate than any other time in history. There's been 5 great extinctions on the planet. Right now we're at number 6. And it's called the Anthropocene epoch, which means it's the first one ever caused by man's actions. And we're losing particularly amphibians, the frogs, the salamanders. They're dying off by species daily. It's not one a year or 3 a year. It's 2, 3 a day. These things raise my attention, and you know, it makes you wonder, well, the world is so large, what can I do about it? What can we do? So what you can do, you're not going to prevent the loss of an amphibian in Costa Rica, but what you can do in planting native plants is start the recovery of some of the species that we're losing here. The bird population that we see now, and we become accustomed to, you know, a gradual loss in visual sighting is kind of overlooked. But what we see now in bird populations is 50% less than what we saw 25 years ago. 50% less. And another poster child is the monarch butterfly. We see 90% less monarch butterflies than we did 20 years ago. And this is all about the loss of species, and it's all about a misunderstanding. You know, we have some of our native plants suffer from the stigma of having as a prefix or suffix the word weed. You know, milkweed, how many of them can you think of that have that suffix of weed? We've been conditioned, we are trying to clean our fields of those things that we've considered weeds, and all along they were those things that we had to have to sustain ourselves with. So it's a tough situation that we're in, but you can do something. This is one of those things that every person doesn't have to do a lot to be doing a lot. If you just decide this spring that you're going to include just a few native plants, that's better than what you did last year. And studies have shown that just, you know, a pocket of Rudbeckia here in the next neighborhood has some Leotris, and the next neighborhood has some foam flower. It all sort of connects, and it all starts to rebuild a little bit. You know, a lot of people are planting milkweed. Again, the poster child for species loss is monarchs, and a lot of people are planting milkweed now. But don't stop there. We're going to look at some slides in a minute that if you're not familiar with native plants, maybe you'll say, why hadn't I been planting these all along? But if you're like me, you didn't know. I came about to native plants. It wasn't a gradual transition. I don't really know how to explain it. It was 4 years ago, and it was like, bam, I've missed the boat for, 50 years. And suddenly I understood that this is where I need to be. And this is so important. And fortunately, it is one of those situations in our ecology as it diminishes. It is one of those situations where we can do something about it. We can make some change just by deciding that you're going to plant some Rudbeckia, that you're going to plant the native geranium rather than, the Pelargonium geranium. Okay, let me try to gather where I am. That's a deep rabbit hole I was just in. Yeah, okay, I thought, I've always, we've got to learn to use, what's that movie that Tom Hanks was in? His plane went down and he crashed. Castaway. I watched that several times now, and, one of the things that hits me, and it's always the same sort of part of the plot in those types of movies where you're stranded on a deserted island, you begin immediately, Tom Hanks, whatever floated up on the shore, he collected. He didn't know at what point he would need it, but he made sure to grab it. He made sure that whatever he had, he either put it to use or he knew it at some point down the road it was going to be of good use. I'm sorry, I didn't turn my phone on. That's like the 15th telemarketer of the day. Anybody know how to stop that? But, you know, he's there by himself on an island, so he decides, as mankind is going to start collecting and saving and using everything that he's got. And it occurs to me that, you know, the truth is that you and I are on an island. It happens to be a huge island, you know, spinning around in space, but there's nothing here that we can't consume to the point of extinction. So it makes sense for us to understand, doesn't it, what we have. And if we don't know how to use it now, then just save it for later use. I've got a quote here that, you know, one of my favorite authors, and if you've never read it, and if you're interested in land ethics, this guy wrote the book on land ethics. His name is Aldo Leopold. How many of you have read Sand County Almanac? No one. You need to read it. You need to read the Sand County Almanac by Aldo Leopold.
What are you saying?
Sand County Almanac. Almanac. He says in that it's beautifully written, and he is really the father of organized conservation efforts. He was a forester that graduated from Harvard, and through his, you know, dealings with forestry work, he suddenly decided, wait a minute, you know, something's not right in what we're doing, and he turned into like the ultimate writer of the conservation ethic. Well, he was the guy that wrote the book on land ethics. It really all started with Aldo Leopold, and he said, to save every cog and wheel is the first precaution of the intelligent tinkerer. And I just love that. And he's talking about, of course, in nature. He's talking about preserving everything and understanding that at some point it's going to be important to you. You know, and it's taken me a while to understand that not just that creation was perfect, but just how perfect it is. Andrew and I were talking just a little while ago, and we're looking, of course, we're growing plants, we're growing native plants, and we're looking at different methods of media and soil inoculants. That's amendments. That's something you add to the soil to put the most robust, most healthy root system that we can on a plant. And one of the things that we do, and some of you may be familiar with, a fungi. And what's happening, what takes place is the fungi, again, attaches to the root system, and it absorbs nutrients and water, and it gives it to the tree, shrub, whatever. And the tree, through photosynthesis, overproduces sugar on purpose, sends it down the trunk of the tree into the root system, into the fungi, because the fungi needs the sugar. So it's such a perfect relationship, and without the fungi in the soil, the growth rate of any species is cut rapidly. So we've started inoculating our growing media with mycorrhizae fungi. And here's how perfect things are. Andrew, in his mushroom propagation, he deals with a fungi called trichoderma. You don't want trichoderma on your shiitake mushroom logs. Trichoderma is that green mold that you find sometimes on your bread. It's very, very common, gets on cheese, very, very common, very aggressive. But it turns out that trichoderma, again, is one of those things that we'll inoculate our growing media with, because it kills, and y'all are not going to be familiar with these, but Kelly may be, it kills Rhizoctonia, Pythium, all these crown rot. It attacks and kills the fungi that I'm in battle with in a greenhouse, and if you're a grower, you're in battle with it, dampening off. It kills that. So my question was, with Andrew, okay, we've got mycorrhizae that I want to inoculate the soil with, and then if I inoculate with trichoderma, this other fungi, am I going to kill my good stuff, my mycorrhizae? No. As part of creation, they work together. I was blown away. I was blown away. Trichoderma is hugely aggressive attacker and killer of other fungi. But this one that plants and trees need for growth, it doesn't touch. It lets it go. It lets that relationship develop. How does that happen? Only through creation. Can we have something that special, that beautiful, and still in that rabbit hole? Listen to this. These are things that amaze me, and I hope y'all are interested. But this mycorrhizae fungi, when it attaches to the root system, it develops a beak on the end of the mycelium. A little beak, you may be familiar, is called a hostorium. I think that's it, called a hostorium. And it penetrates the root system, bam, stick its beak in there, and starts the transfer of nutrients. But the amazing thing is that somehow it injects the beak into that root system without damaging any cell structure at all. Somehow it knows exactly an intermediary between the cell structure of the plant. It never damages the plant. Never. See, these are the things that I read about and I go, wow. There's something special about how our ecology, how creation was established. The creation was absolutely perfect in every way. There was no fallacy. And when we start messing with the way things were set up, as in using invasive or exotic species, then we start creating trouble. And that's where we are right now. Now, I was brought in here today kind of on the auspices that I would talk about how to use native plants. But I knew I would, I knew I would get off on my stump and start preaching to you a little bit. But I can't help it. I'm kind of like, one of my favorite, and I shouldn't even go here, but one of my favorite authors when I was young, when I mean young, just out of college, and I had moved out to Arizona, and Nanette had bought me a couple of books to take with me, one of them Desert Solitaire, and the other one was a collection of Thoreau's work, and I got so far off into Thoreau while I was out there that Nanette thought I was really getting weird. And I probably was, but I'm telling you, it's amazing how we're given some individuals 160 years ago the right words that are right today. We now know that it was right. And like Aldo Leopold, that's 70 years ago, he defined proper land ethics, and now we adhere to that. We try to adhere to that. It's 70 years later, we decide, hey, he was right. But particularly, some things that struck me with, and I'll move on because I'm not some really literate reader, but Thoreau wrote something that had such a shocking effect on me 40 years ago when I was in Arizona that it still stays with me today, and I go back to it often. He was living out at Walden's Pond, and he came into town, Concord, New Hampshire, and I don't know what he was doing in town, but one of the elders walked up to him, and I'm kind of putting this all together. Once you read somebody, you kind of know how they work. But he comes into town, one of the elders walks up to him and says, "Now, aren't you that fella living out there on that pond by yourself? Like, you idiot, you get a job." And Thoreau, I'm sure, in kind of haughty manner, "Well, yes, I am. I am that fella." And this man says to him, this elder man says to him, he said, "Well, let me tell you something. 40 years ago, when I was a young man, you would not have lived out there by yourself. You would not have been out there by yourself, because there was cougars, there was bears, there was wolves, and hit the road like he was thunderstruck. And we got back to his cabin. He wrote this down in his journal. And I thought it's so beautiful. And again, this is one of those things I go back to, and it probably will have no meaning to you, but maybe you'll understand me a little bit better. But when he got back, he wrote this in his journal. He says, I got to put my glasses on. And thinking that I have here the entire poem, and thinking that I have here read the entire poem, and to my chagrin, I hear that it's but an imperfect copy that I possess and that I have read, that my ancestors have come before me and torn out some of the first leaves, some of the grandest passages. And what he's talking about is, he gets back to his cabin and he's like, I'm not living in a wilderness. All this stuff is gone. I thought I was out here really roughing it in the wilderness. But all the grandest passages and have indeed mutilated it in some places. This is 160 years ago. And he says, I should not like to think that some demigod had come before me and plucked out some of the brightest stars of heaven. I wish to live an entire heaven and an entire earth. But anyway, I do a lot of daydreaming about such as that. What was it like 300 years ago for a naturalist like myself, an ecologist like myself? What was it like 300 years ago? I would love to experience that. Have any of you ever been to the Joyce-Kilmer National Forest? Well, I loaded up my family about 10 or 15 years ago, maybe longer than that, on a pilgrimage to the Joyce-Kilmer. Now, we were going to Washington, D.C., but I was going to the Joyce-Kilmer. But what it is about, and I could be wrong, like 1,200 acres that Mr. Peabody missed with his saws and, left it there, is a virgin forest. And it's oak trees and poplar trees and hemlock trees like the world was 300 years ago. And it's the most amazing thing you've ever seen in your life. You should go. You should go. To see a poplar tree that's 12 feet across. Yellow poplar, 12 feet across. To understand the men that it took to, chop these things down, you could load a rail car with one tree. But it was so spectacular to see that creation and how it had come about and how it had sustained itself. One of the things that really bites my craw is, and I'm going to offend some of you, is the landowners that say, well, it's time to cut those trees. It's time to cut those trees. I'm sorry, but there's more value than economics in your trees, and there always will be. There's never a time to cut the trees unless it's for economics. And I know you're landowners and you have to make some money off the land. I'm not saying don't cut your trees, but I am saying there's a right way and a wrong way. And here in North Mississippi and here in Mississippi in general, we go in and cut it down to the knob, which is the wrong way. Again, back to Thoreau, he said, why do we deem our land good when we've gnawed it down to that of a sheep's pasturage? It was good before. I'm sorry, I'm preaching to you now. And we're supposed to be looking at slides. Now, I hadn't even gotten through this yet. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about, what is a native plant? Most of you can define that, I think. But surprisingly, most of us who are supposed to know can't define it, because there is a big to-do about just exactly what is a native plant. From my perspective as a grower, what is a native plant? So the truth is that I'm growing plants that I'm bringing in from New Jersey and Pennsylvania and Florida. They are American native plants. But in the strictest terms, I'm not really doing what my intentions will be 5 years from now. when I can build up that genotype of local species, and that's what we try to do. Like I did collect Indian grass, I did collect Jacob's ladder, I did collect bloodroot, and that's valuable for you guys, because if you do buy some plants from me, you're going to have plants that have local genotype, and they're going to be the ones that do best in North Mississippi. But we're left with having to buy stuff from New Jersey, and you know, and that's the reason one of the reasons I've got into production is you can't find this stuff. And I'm trying to landscape with it, and I have to buy plants from New Jersey. That's ridiculous. So one of the reasons, and not really, I would suppose, not really the main reason, I meant to start my clock and didn't, is that you can't find the stuff. So I have started production, so I'm gonna have my, I'm gonna have my stuff. What is a native plant? Let me get around where I can read it. Can y'all read that? Probably not. Can y'all read that? Really? You wanna read that aloud? A native is indigenous species, one that occurs in particular region, ecosystem, habitat without direct or indirect human action. Okay, that's one definition. A native species, this is one of the things, okay, I'm jumping around now, but this is important for you to know. If you are considering planting native plants, yeah, it's great to plant 1, 3, 5 Rudbeckia, but if you happen to have a field that you would like to develop into a native plant meadow, then this is what you have to consider, is native plant communities, because our natives exist in communities. Because within those communities, they all kind of work off of each other. So you really have to study, and that's what any gardener does anyway, don't you? If you're planning on what you're going to plant this spring, and you're decided you want to try something different, you're not just going to go to the garden center and buy one and stick it out, are you? You're going to study it. You're going to figure out. You're going to try to figure out what it's going to take to grow it. Aren't you? You should. That's you know, if you'll study it a little bit, you can determine which plants are going to do well in whatever site. And you do have to determine your site. You do have to determine what are my intentions with my native plants. Do I just want to contribute by planting a few? Or do I want to attract butterflies by planting milkweed? Or do I want to attract birds by planting aronia, you know, some of the berry producing plants and some of the grasses? So have an intention to it. If you do happen to have a place where you can create a pocket garden or maybe even a meadow, have some intention to it, and put in the study, put in the work to understand how to grow them. You know, one of the misconceptions, you're going to have to keep time for me because I didn't stop. One of the misconceptions that we have with native plants is that they're native. All you got to do is stick them out and let them go. No, that's not going to work. You have to, just like if you were planting your petunias, or just like if you was planting your holly shrub this spring, you're going to have to take care of it for the first year anyway. Then that's when the advantage comes into natives, because once it's established, it's going to survive. It's going to survive drought. It's going to survive flood. Yeah, it may die back. It may go dormant early, but it's going to do whatever it takes to survive. Where your exotics from other parts of the world, they may die off. Natives are going to survive, but you do have to tend to them for that first year. Get them going. Now, another point I'd like to make, you know, let's say that I wanted to plant that coneflower. Yeah, coneflower there, purple coneflower. You know, some of us as gardeners, we rush out and buy the best potting soil that we can find, and we run back and dig a hole and stick it in that, and we just fill it up with potting soil and say, oh, that's great, it's got to do well. That's not what you want to do. You have to, we have a lot of clay in our area, and you're going to have to break that clay up. But guess what? In that clay are the beneficial bacterias, the myceliums, all that stuff that we've been talking about. So when I'm planting natives and I don't want to do a lot of tilling and rebuilding, I will dig a large hole, a deep hole, but I'm saving those spoils into a wheelbarrow, and then I'm going to mix some bark or something in there with it to break up that clay. But use your native soil. Be sure to mix. I try to think like half and half, because in your native soil, again, is where all the good stuff is. All the naturally occurring elements and whatnot. These guys out in the woods, out in the wilderness, they're not being fertilized. You know, they just need a good start. What else do we see there? Coneflowers, highly recommend, because you're going to be successful with coneflowers. This one I am so excited about. This is Rudbeckia maxima. I'm not sure what the common name of it is. Do you know what the common name of it is? Rudbeckia maxima. I think it's just called
Large coneflower.
large coneflower. But it's, look at, I don't think you can see the foliage, but the foliage on it is about yay big and kind of has a bluish cast. But look what a cut flower that makes. Tall stem. We just potted that today, as a matter of fact. But I'm excited about those. This is a, if you're blessed, and I truly mean blessed, because I love woodland plants, and you have a good woodland site, this is you can walk in North Mississippi in a good hardwood forest, and in a swag where there's plenty of moisture, you can find this. These are all native plants in a native situation with May apples, foam flower, and red trillium, which would be a little bit rare for us. White trillium, maybe pulicum. But again, these are your shady plants and fern down here. And these guys are pretty easy to grow. Because normally in a shady in the woods area, if it hadn't been cut in too recent years, you're going to have a pretty good soil structure there. And these guys, again, they like good drainage, they like a lot of leaf mold, and be sure, one thing that you can note, any native plant in the woodlands is mulch forever. Is never without a mulch layer. With leaf mold. Save those leaves. They're hugely important. Again, that's the leaves is where we get a lot of the bacterium. This one I've never planted en masse. I've planted a few just to see how they would do for me. This is called, what's it called? Virginia bluebells. And they've done great. They've done great. They what?
They do well here.
Yes, they do well here. Now you're going to have to find, again, a shady site and one that's going to have ample moisture. Really, north side of the slope. North and east, maybe. But spectacular plant. These are ephemerals. You know, we're looking at ephemerals. Who knows what an ephemeral is? Everybody knows. Okay, these guys, once we get into the heat, and these are probably the smartest plants, really. That once you get into the heat of the year, they're going to go back in the ground and take the summer drought out of the question. They're just going to go back in the ground and come back up next spring. The trilliums and May apples and all that you saw a while ago, those are called ephemerals. Here today, gone tomorrow. This is what we're trying to do with the project here in town. I'm not going to tell you where, but it's a very long process to get something like this established. Because the first part of the process is you have to eliminate all the alien species. And that's a lot harder than you think, because they are, most of them are seed producers. And once you kill that out and disturb the soil a little bit, they come right back up. There's a seed bank that goes on forever and ever, it seems. But that is something that I find spectacular. And what's happening there? It's beautiful to look at, but what else is happening there? Pollinators. You are raising pollinators right there. Not only pollinators, but in the fall of the year, these guys have large amount of seeds. So the birds hang around as well. Food source. All about food source. That, you know, plenty of you, I suspect, would look at and say, well, that needs to be mowed. But I look at it as a naturalist, I guess, and say, that's what I want. That is what I want. That is as low maintenance as you can get if you're a yard person. What they've done is just mowed a strip down it so they can walk and admire it. And a lot of grasses, and I could spend days talking to you about our native grasses and how important they are and why you must consider planting grasses. If you don't plant coneflower, plant one of the grasses. They're spectacular. You know, for whatever reason, grasses came out as an ornamental maybe 30 years ago. A lot of these exotic grasses from, well, pampas grass have been around quite a while. But for whatever reason, they just really never caught my fancy as far as use in the landscape until I started discovering what our native grasses look like and what they're doing for you and I to have them there. They are mega seed producers. If you've got native grasses, you are providers. You are providing for so many birds. They produce an enormous amount of seeds, and they come back every year. In the landscape, I love them because there's almost 4 seasons of interest in them, and you don't get that out of many plants. They come up in the spring, beautiful green. As they mature, like blue stem, they start taking on a blue cast to them. And then they go to seed, which, you know, is attractive, and they move in the wind. They add character and movement to any garden. And then as fall hits, blue stem, for instance, turns this brilliant red orange. And the grass persists through the winter time, and you still have that movement in your garden through that. And right about now, we've started going in and cutting them back to the ground. So you get 9 months out of them. There's not a lot of plants that have that much utility to them than grasses. And our favorites are, of course, and that gets back to what is a native plant. You know, there's our natives, blue stem, little blue stem, big blue stem, Indian grass, plume grass. Some of those are the native grasses. And as we develop cultivars off these things and make them prettier and prettier. And there's a lot of cultivars of blue stem. So that's why I raised the question from our perspective, what is a native plant? Because there's plenty that will tell you that a cultivar is not a native plant, even though it may be blue stem by name. But its tag is little blue stem, blue heaven. You know, that's one of the cultivars. Now, and what happens as we develop as breeders, I say we, I'm not a breeder, but what happens as plants are developed through breeding, the color may change a little bit, or the flower size may change a little bit. And guess what? Insects don't recognize it. They don't recognize it. It's got to be the native. Now that's not, I'm not telling you that, see they recognize flowers and they're gonna pollinate them. But when it comes to a host plant, the ones that they have to have for survival for future generations, not gonna deal with it. They want the native. They only want the native. That's a milkweed, and I forget the common name of it. It's not native, it's a Mexican milk, but it's pretty, so a lot of people are planting it. You know, I would never have, until recently, tried to sell you yucca. But I'm telling you that our native one, which is Yucca filamentosa, is a wonderful plant. It's a wonderful plant. And couple it with some grasses, that looks like a white muhly grass, Another one of our native grasses here is muhly grass. Spectacular. Maybe I have a picture of pink muhly grass. Of course, that's one of everybody's favorite. Everybody knows what that is, right? That's Leotris, and I'm not sure if Cibolda or
Is that
Spicata.
banned in other states, though?
Pardon me?
Is it a different variety, the one that's banned in other states, the pink oleatrus,
I didn't know there was any banned in other states.
as invasive in other states?
Well, you know, invasive has two different, it's hard to say, it's hard to refer to as a native plant to be invasive, but sometimes people do term it invasive if it gets in the garden and then spreads everywhere. But Leotris is a bulb, so it would be difficult for it to be an invasive plant. And this is our coneflower that, I don't know that we have that around here. We do have it around Starkville. This is, I think, Echinacea pallida. Gray-headed coneflower, maybe, something like that. Retivita? Maybe so. I included this picture for a particular reason. Self-promotion. Go ahead. Swamp milkweed, butterfly milkweed, wild blue indigo. Now, we don't have blue indigo native here. We have white indigo.
Can we throw that wild blue indigo? 'Cause
Yeah.
that's some seeds.
Yeah. You're not gonna have to.
I got Joe Pye weed.
Pale purple coneflower, Joe Pye. Right. Anyway, Camp Creek native plants are producing all of these plants right here. One of my favorite grasses, this is drop seed, isn't it? Clear drop seed. Wonderful grass.
That rattlesnake master. Talk about that for a minute.
That is, can you see it?
I see that it's number L on your list.
Yeah, it's hard to see on there. Do you grow it? Sure.
I do.
Yeah, it's a great plant. It has a continuous blue color to it, and it produces a flower that is a kind of like just a spiny ball. But it's wonderful if you like to cut flowers and to arrange with it. But it's a great plant, very hardy plant. It's going to like a lot of sun, plenty of sunlight, and I've mixed it with little blue stem. If you just intermingle it with little blue stem, its flower heads that poke above the grass line of blue stem. But it's a great plant. I am growing it, by the way. I'm self-promoting, that's what I'm here for. Just another example of a nice little pocket garden. This is something that's easy to do, not a large garden at all. And it's included with plants that you will be successful with, Rudbeckia and Echinacea and Leotris, and I can't see what else is in there. But that's part of the study that you do, or talk to someone who's involved with native plants, such as myself or any share or whoever. Which are those plants that are really not going to take any special care at all? You know, you can you can plant Echinacea, and as long as you keep it watered as you would anything else, it's going to produce. It's a wonderful plant. Back to the woodland garden, and this is going to be Solomon seal. I'm not sure. That must be, I can't really tell that, I can't see it. But this is Senecio, Pacra aurea. Really one of my favorite woodlands. And the one thing about native plants is you're able to select any site. I don't care if it stays wet year round. There's natives for it. And this is going to be a wet site with this plant growing there and the ferns. And even though, well, there's ginger also. Canada ginger, don't pass on that as an excellent ground cover in the shade. Canada ginger. And some people even cook with it, but and the whatever that is. Solomon seal. Solomon seal. Solomon seal, I consider one of those plants that you can't fail with. Keep it watered. And so there's lots of this kind of stuff that's available. Coneflowers are available anywhere at the nursery. And again, it's back to what you want. You have to make your own personal decision. You're going to buy orange coneflowers or you're going to buy the native coneflower. Butterflies are going to come to both of them, but our native insects specifically recognize the native plant as with anything else. They hone in on native first. Just more gardens. You know, that's something that, well, there's a lot of stuff there, as a matter of fact, but it doesn't take a lot. You know, even if your yard is already beautifully landscaped. Now this one is almost completely natives. This is a goldenrod I'm growing called Fireworks. By the way, goldenrods are great plants, and there's so many of them. And again, that's a cultivar. Is that Joe Pye weed right there? If you really want to draw butterflies, plant Joe Pye weed. Plant Joe Pye weed and buttonbush. They go crazy over it. What's the time? Pardon? Oh. Okay, well, you know, let me flash through them real quick. Ironweed, very hardy. I think it will grow on upland sites as well as wet sites. I know it will. I know it particularly likes wet sites, but it'll probably, a lot of these things will move to other locations. And one thing that I like to tell people, when I'm doing a native plant garden for them, I generally leave by saying, you know, I'm just getting them started. They're going to figure out where they want to be. You know, they're going to move. If they don't like where I put them, and I'm doing my best to figure out where they're going to like it, but I'm definitely going to be wrong sometimes. They're going to move. They're going to go to conditions they like best. So be tolerant. That's all I can tell you is be tolerant. Rain gardens, okay, well, that's it. And I'm supposed to.